Awesome, awesome, awesome. Welcome to Thursday Church, where we're doing church differently while staying true to the message of Jesus Christ. Hey, if you're joining us online, we're always glad that you're with us. We hope that you feel welcomed, and we are thankful for the opportunity to have the internet and we can glorify God through that medium. Hey, I'm excited about our new series, because we're getting ready to start this new series for this month of October, and I'm excited because I'm hoping that it's going to bring us new insight. I hope that it's going to challenge us. I hope that we're going to take something very, very simple and choose to be obedient in something that a lot of us probably have stepped past. And even though it's very simple to understand, it's one of those things that ordained by God, and we are called to be obedient in this particular area. And one of the things that'll happen if we as a church embrace the obedience in this particular area that we're going to talk about for the month of October, it'll change our community. And I know that's a tall order to say, oh yeah, that sounds pretty arrogant, doesn't it? We think we can change our community, but we can. Because we serve a God who's that powerful, that phenomenal, that awesome, that capable. And all he's asking from us is that we are found obedient. And folks, when we are found obedient, amazing things happen. And while we're talking about is just one word, it's one word that's very, very powerful. It's one word that can bring big change. It's one word that Jesus chose to speak about at the end of his life. Here's the thing. As I think about the last week that Jesus walked the face of the earth, no one knew it was his last week to be on the face of the earth except for him. He knew. And I am just extremely attracted to the things that he said in that last week. I always have been, but more so since now I've walked through a last week with a loved one. And I know that in my humanness, if I held those conversations, cherished them carefully, and in those moments chose only to speak of the things that were significant, Jesus, in his divine nature, I'm assuming he did the exact same thing. You see, I know you're all aware, I lost my mom a few weeks ago, and in the last few days with her, I didn't spend a single second speaking of anything that was insignificant, trivial, things that didn't matter. The only things I spoke into her ear were things of great importance. Spoke of how much we loved her. Spoke of eternity and the fact that she was gonna take her last breath and walk with Jesus, and those were the things that we talked about. We didn't talk about anything that was insignificant. And so when I look at Scripture and I know that this is something that Jesus was teaching in one of his last days, I think that it had to be something of great importance. See, I can't imagine that he would waste a single second. I can't imagine. He's Jesus. He's not going to waste a single second on anything that isn't monumentally important. So, this topic for the month of October, this one word that we're going to speak of, is a word of great significance, because Jesus chose to speak this in his last days. Now, I know that all of the ministry of Jesus was powerful. The 3 years he walked the face of this earth ministering, all of that stuff is powerful. But for me, there's just something about these final conversations that hold great weight. These final conversations where we're saying, I just want to make sure you know this. And you might be surprised, but the word we're talking about is neighbor. In Jesus' final days here on earth, he spoke and taught about this issue of how we treat our neighbor. And I was trying to think how many times I've heard sermons about neighboring. And I'm not so sure that I've ever heard one that really, really, really pushed the issue talking about this person living right next door. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this one word and we are going to dissect it. We are going to fillet it, so to speak. We are going to talk about and study about and think upon and ponder our own actions and see if they line up with what Jesus was saying in these final days as he spoke about neighboring. Open a Bible and let's turn to Mark chapter 12, and we are going to be looking at the verses 28 through 31. That's page 842 if you're using one of our Bibles. And so here we are, and we're at this point in history when Jesus is going to be very pointed with his words, and he's talking to the religious leaders of the day who have done something that they probably should have never done. But they have complicated what God has given them in an attempt to honor God. They took his words and they made them far more complicated than God ever intended for them to be. As a matter of fact, this is what they did. So the Lord gave us 10 commandments. So they looked at those 10 commandments and they said, you know what we need to do? We need to make some boundary laws. And this is what a boundary law is. A boundary law is a law that protects you before you get to the actual law. So they made up over 600 different laws that were boundary laws that protected the laws that God had given. And they thought if they had all of these laws in place, then you know, we wouldn't even get close to breaking the real laws if we had all of these other things, and there were penalties and punishment for breaking all these other laws that work your way up to the law. And all they did was complicate the truth. And nobody knew what really was the law anymore because they had made it so complicated. It was so cumbersome. It was so difficult to understand. And they had all these different levels of penalties for each particular law. And it was just tough stuff. And they took what was clear and concise, and they made it complicated. And so this religious leader approaches Jesus, and he's like, you know, hey, Jesus, out of all of these commandments, would you just tell us, which is the most important? I just really want to know. And so it wasn't a question of he wasn't trying to trick Jesus. He wasn't trying to say that some of these laws weren't important. He just wanted to know, you know, could you just tell me what's the most important law? So this is what Jesus said, verse 28. One of the teachers of the religious law was standing there listening to the debate. Jesus is talking to some other people at this point. And he realized that Jesus had answered well. As he's listening to Jesus give answers to religious leaders, he realizes, hey, this Jesus, he's giving good answers. I'm gonna ask him my question. Of all the commandments, which is the most important? And Jesus replied, the most important command is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is equally important. Okay, so it sounds like he's saying two things, but what he's saying is, here's this commandment, here's this commandment. They are equally important. So I'm telling you what the most important commandment is, and there are two pieces to it, but it's equally important. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love, not like, not tolerate, not know. He didn't just say know who your neighbors are. He said love. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So what Jesus was saying at this point, what he's doing, he's summing up what's been taking place with the religious leaders and all these boundary laws that they've put into place. And what he's saying here is, you guys have made it too complicated. It's not this complicated. If you will just do what you've been asked to do, you'll be able to follow the Big Ten. You'll be able to do this. And it's not that complicated. Love God. And if you love God, you're going to be able to do all of these other things. Love God, but you've got to love your neighbor as yourself. And then you're going to be successful in these other commandments. Don't make it so complicated. And in the process of saying love God, he's also saying, hey folks, this relationship thing, this neighbor thing is extremely important. And I've been thinking about this issue a lot because Pastor Jason and I were talking about did we really want to do a whole series on the issue of neighbor? And it's like, well, if Jesus said it is the most important commandment, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, I think we better spend a little time. I think we better not just say that we know the information. I think we better digest it. I think we better chew on it. I think we better be real and honest with ourselves. How are we really doing with loving our neighbors? You know, I started thinking about this issue of when you select a house that's going to be a home. And this has been on my mind a lot lately because Mike and I and his mother Lula are in the process of selecting a home where the three of us can live together. And so as we've been doing this, processing, thinking through what this is going to look like, do you know not one single time, in all the houses we've looked at, and I am really embarrassed to say, but we've looked at over 50 houses. So it kind of sounds like I'm picky, but I'm not. And it's just that this is a big deal for us. We're putting two households into one, three independent thinkers into one house. We need to make sure we all have what we need, and we all have this wish list. We all have this desire to have this and this and this and this, and we want to make sure that when we're all needing to get ready at the same time, there's enough bathroom space, and we just, got to make sure that we can afford it, and, all that kind of stuff. But in the process of when I told you that we've looked at over 50 houses, when I was typing this, I almost just said we've looked at a lot of houses and let you figure out what a lot is. Like 10, 12. Honestly, we've probably looked at closer to 100, to be honest. I mean, it's not a lot of houses. We've been doing this for 2 years. And I'm excited to tell you, I think we found the one and should be moved before Christmas. So we're excited about that. But in the process, do you know what we've never asked? Not in one single house did we ask about the neighbors. I just find that so odd now. Now that we're thinking about the importance of neighboring, and yet we're trying to select a home and we're worried about bathrooms and kitchen space and living space, but yet the thing that God commanded, that we're to love our neighbors, we didn't ask about the neighbors, not one time. I sure hope I can love my new neighbors because I think we kind of failed on that one. This whole issue of our neighbors is important stuff. It's important because it deals with relationships. And this term, neighbor, it can mean the person living right next to you, but it can also mean more than that. It's one of the, and we're going to talk about the more than that next week. But this week, we're talking about the person who's physically next door to you, okay? So while we can take this bigger approach, I thought I need to see what the world defines as a neighbor. What does the world define? So I looked in Webster's dictionary, and I was shocked. I was shocked at the definition because it's almost like I'm looking at my Bible. It said neighbor, one living or located near another. Okay, got it. Neighbor, a fellow man, as in Matthew 19. This is Webster's dictionary. As in Matthew 19:19, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The dictionary. What a rare example where the world's definition and God's definition have come together and they're totally in sync. That this issue of neighboring can be this person right next door, or it can be humankind. In other words, relationships are extremely important. Connecting with the people around us has value. But see, the thing is, connecting with the people around you has value for believers just in the same way as it does for non-believers. This is one of those things that when you have a bad relationship, if you are a non-believer or if you are a believer, it affects you. If you have a good relationship, if you are a believer or a non-believer, it affects you. So it turns out that this neighboring thing is really important, and that there's this common ground no matter who you are. But for believers, it's amped up a little bit because God has said this is an opportunity for you to reach people for Christ, period. That's what this issue of neighboring and relationships are all about. See, if you can't have relationships with people, they probably aren't going to listen to you as you share about Jesus. See, I kind of wonder, have we lost the art of neighboring? You know, when I was a little girl growing up, our neighbors were an important part of our life. We connected with one another, and it was a good thing. You know, when my parents needed some help, the neighbors would come over. If they needed help, my parents would go over. We watched out for each other. They talked. They communicated. They knew what was going on in each other's lives. They shared joys together. They shared sorrows together. When my mother brought me home from the hospital, the very first person there waiting was neighbor. And these people were important in our lives. And there in our kitchen, taped to the wall next to the phone, and this is when the phone hung on the wall, but there was a sheet of paper, and it had everyone's name and their phone number right there. We saw it every night when we ate dinner. There were all the names of our neighbors and their phone numbers so that we could call them. I can still remember some of the numbers, 882-1872. I can still remember several of the phone numbers of our neighbors when I was growing up on Meadowlark Lane. How many of you can remember a phone number of a neighbor? That's amazing to me. That is amazing to me. But you see, they didn't just know us. They were a part of our lives. And when we kids did something wrong, it didn't matter if our parents were the ones to see it. If one of the neighbors saw, the neighbor felt very comfortable in disciplining and correcting us. I remember on one particular occasion, a lady that lived 3 doors down, her name was Juanita. And Juanita set myself and Julie, another neighbor girl, in timeout. I wouldn't do this now because I think they'd call CPS on me, but this is what she did. She made us sit on the picnic table, and she disciplined us because we had taken the garden hose and sprayed some of the other kids in the neighborhood. And she didn't call my mom and say, I'm sending Debbie home because she sprayed Nita Gale with the hose. She didn't. She said, you girls, sit down now. And she made us sit forever. It was like all afternoon. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, but it felt like all afternoon. And when I went home, I was mad. And I told my mom, Juanita made us sit on the picnic table. And do you know what my mom did? She picked up the phone and called Juanita. What did they do? And I got in trouble again. Because these neighbors were a connection, a relationship. They were part of our lives. We shared life together, and I can't help but wondering, have we lost that? Because we're so busy. And yet, Jesus said this is one of the most important things we will ever do. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. See, neighboring gives us the ability to step into someone's life and share joys, hardships, to share the journey of life. But see, when we step into the lives of others, there's an extreme blessing in doing that. And that's why Jesus commanded. I want you to get this, folks. This isn't a suggestion. When I say this would change our community, it would change our community if we all said that we are going to neighbor in the fashion that Jesus has mandated. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That kind of love. Love him with all that you've got. And then, equally, love your neighbor as yourself. So I've been thinking a lot about this obedience thing. How obedient are we to live out what Jesus has commanded as the greatest commandment of all? And see, the first thing that came to mind was it really would change our community. It would change our community. It would strengthen us because elderly people would be checked in on. It would change our community because single moms who are struggling to get by would be given a helping hand from time to time. It would change our community because at-risk kids who are doing things, crying out for attention, would be receiving some attention. They would be receiving some guidance. There would be somebody not afraid to say, sit yourself down. What you did was wrong. Think about what you just did. It would change our community. And instead of chaos, there would be love. See, realistically, there's this whole list of social issues and problems that would be averted if we simply loved our neighbor. I mean, we've called out for social agencies and the government to step in and mandate what Jesus is calling us to do. It isn't the responsibility of a social agency. It isn't the responsibility of the government. It is the responsibility of believers in Jesus Christ. And see, the thing is, much like the Jews of the first century who made all these boundary laws, we've done the exact same thing. We are no different than they are, except instead of laws, we've made up excuses. We have every excuse under the sun why we are not communicating, why we are not in a relationship with the neighbors, why we don't even know their names. You know, I'm embarrassed to say, there are people a few doors down from me, I have no idea who they are. I don't even know their name. That's embarrassing. And so we've come up with all of these excuses. And just like the Jews with their boundary laws, we say, well, see, I don't know my neighbor because they're so much younger than I am. We don't have anything in common. I don't know my neighbor because they're so old. I don't have anything in common with those people. I don't want to know my neighbor because they're just downright mean. They're scary. I don't want to know my neighbor because I think they do weird things in their house. You see, they're up all hours of the night. I'll get up to go to the bathroom and I see their lights on at 3 o'clock in the morning. They're weird. They must be doing something illegal over there. I don't want to know them. I don't want to get mixed up with that. I don't want to know my neighbor because they let their dog come over and do their dog thing in my yard instead of their yard, and that makes me mad. I don't like to clean up their dog thing. I don't want to know my neighbor because they don't give Halloween candy to the kids. They must really have some issues. I don't want to know my neighbor, and the list just goes on and on and on and on and on. And we have all of these excuses. And yet, it comes down to the fact that we just are not being obedient. We are not doing what God has called us to do. And somewhere along the line, and I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line, in all of our busyness, with moms and dads both working, with kids being in every sport known to mankind, every activity under the sun, we're going 9 different directions all the time. Somewhere we've bought into this notion that we don't have to take time to reach out to anyone. Now, if they reach out to us, oh, fine. But we don't have to take the time to reach out to our neighbors. We just don't have to take the time. And that's a lie given to us from the enemy. And it's one of those little lies that we have taken and embraced, and we don't even realize we've done it. And we don't even realize that we are being disobedient to what God is calling us to, because we've bought into the notion that we don't have to neighbor the way folks used to neighbor. But Jesus wants us to do this. He said, neighboring matters. Because, you see, if you get to know your neighbors get to know you. And if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, what happens as you get to know your neighbors and your neighbors get to know you, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, they see Jesus in you. Before studying this for this sermon, I would have unashamedly told you, Mike and I are phenomenal neighbors. We are fabulous neighbors. We got neighbors that don't mow their yard. We always keep our yard mowed. We are good neighbors. We make sure that if trash is thrown, we live on Washington Avenue, so there's always trash. We pick up the trash. And even if it's in the neighbor's yard, we pick up that trash because it's going to blow into our yard. So we pick up the trash. We're such good neighbors. We don't play loud, obnoxious music. We're good neighbors. We don't have a dog that barks all hours of the night. We're good neighbors. And should the postal worker accidentally leave the neighbor's mail in our mailbox, we're such good neighbors. Do you know what we do? We take that mail and we go put it in their mailbox. I didn't say I knocked on their door. I said, pardon me, but I seem to have your mail. How are you doing today? Heavens no. I wait till it turns dark and I walk right over there and put it in their mailbox. So I don't have to speak to them. We are horrible neighbors. See, none of these things that I thought marked us as a good neighbor, like when you drive by our house is pleasant to look at. We make sure that we water our plants, and we want our house to be pleasant to look at for our neighbors. None of that is important. None of that stuff matters. See, because none of that stuff will cause a connection. None of that stuff will cause a relationship. None of that stuff will build a friendship. We're horrible neighbors. I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. We aren't offering care. We aren't offering compassion. We aren't offering friendship. About 4 years ago, Mike said, hey, I think I'm going to pull the grill out front, and I'm just going to grill up a whole bunch of meat and just see who comes by and gets something to eat. I said, people will think you are a weirdo. He wanted to neighbor, and I told him he was a weirdo. See, we've got to be checking the obedience meter in regard to what Jesus has said is the greatest commandment. Are we connecting? Are we building relationships? Are we caring? Are we really, really caring? Because see, relationship, connection, and friendships, they allow those who don't know the God of this universe. Folks, this is the whole reason we neighbor. They allow those who don't know the God of this universe to meet him through those who do. We have to take the words of Jesus very seriously. He chose to talk about this in his final days. See, I think Christians like the notion of talking about neighboring from a 50,000 feet perspective. Oh, yeah, anyone can be my neighbor. That's true. Webster's dictionary just made it really clear. Humankind. We're good at being kind to strangers. I was in Harold's last night, and knowing I was going to be talking about neighboring, I was checking out how I treat strangers. And I treat strangers better than I treat my neighbors. Hi, how are you? How are you? Hi. Hi. I don't even do that to my neighbors. I keep my head down and I pull in the driveway fast as I can. See, we can't have a 50,000 feet broad interpretation of neighboring. Everyone in the world is my neighbor. Oh, that's sweet. No, we got to have a 50-foot interpretation that takes us right next door. It's time. It's time that we were extremely honest with ourselves, literal, so to speak, because we can't just do a decent job at being kind to strangers. We got to be kind to the very people that God has placed around us, because neighboring matters. And I don't mean just know your neighbor's name. Care, relationship, compassion, friendship. That's the core of that commandment. How are we really doing? How are we really doing on this journey that God has placed us on? And maybe, just maybe, if we would find ourselves obedient in this area, it would drastically change the face of our community. See, we got to take his words and we got to live them out. Because when Jesus said, I'm going to reduce down all the teaching, I'm going to reduce down all the commandments, I'm going to reduce down all the writings, I'm going to reduce down all the prophecy, I'm going to bring it down to one simple thought that is so easy for you to understand. Love God and love others. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. See, when we become better neighbors, we become better people. We become a better community. And when we become better people and a better community, we become who God created us to be. I don't know about you, but I want to be who God created me to be. I want to look at every nook and cranny of who I am in my humanity. And I don't want to sidestep something just because it's uncomfortable, or just because I have 100 excuses as to why I don't want to do something. I want to look at every aspect of who I am, and I want to honor God with my life. And when we do that as Christians, we change the world around us. And this happens little by little. As we progress in our holiness, as we progress in our faith. Folks, I want you to hear me. Neighboring is an issue of faith. It is. So over the next several weeks, we're going to introduce some action steps that are going to help us, challenge us to be better neighbors. And we're going to ask ourselves, are we willing to make some improvements that will help us connect with the God of this universe in the way that He designed us to connect with Him? We want to honor Him through this issue of neighboring. So I want you to take your seat reminder, and I want you to put it somewhere that you can see often. And I want you praying, this is your first action step. I want you praying, Lord, help me love my neighbors. And I want you just praying for them. And if you don't know their name, then I want you to take this seat reminder and I want you to learn their names this week. I've got some work to do. I've got some work to do because I've got some people 3 doors down on the other side of the road. I don't have any idea who they are. And we have some neighbors that don't like us. But guess what? I'm supposed to love them anyway. So, this week, Lord, help me love my neighbor. Who's going to pray that with me? Amen.